You hear it first. A single, deliberate sonar ping, recorded in a sealed archive that was supposed to be silent forever. Then the logbook page turns. The date stings. Years after the Navy swore this submarine was gone, on a rust-dark bulkhead, a name is scratched into steel. The captain's signature. The same hand. Long after the boat ceased to exist. One submarine was never decommissioned. The paper trail shouldn't be there. Men are missing. A vessel stayed alive, on paper, or in the dark. To understand why one boat refused to die, we go back to when hundreds were sunk on purpose. The war ended, and the water filled with metal. Hulls lined up in quiet rows, paint chalked by salt and sun. Crews discharged to land and ordinary jobs. The country wanted peacetime. The Navy needed budget lines to breathe again. Orders followed. Strike the names, strip the radios, scuttle what couldn't be sold. A generation of steel would slip beneath the waves by policy, not battle. There was a ritual to making a fighting ship vanish. Inventory every valve and wrench, certify the weapons were long gone. Close the last official log with a neat hand. Strike the hull from the Naval Vessel Register. Send the carcass to a breaker, or tow it to a rectangle of ocean measured in coordinates, where it would be opened at the seacocks and lowered, quiet as a secret. Mothball fleets stood in reserve like sleeping towns, rows of grey houses with their doors welded shut, until orders came to thin them. Midnight sinkings took care of the rest. A tug, a skeleton crew, a final cigarette on a cold rail. Men watched ink-black water slide over numbers they'd painted as boys and went home without ceremony. 200 ships processed like that. Clean, documented, predictable. Then a file broke the rhythm. It didn't look like a scandal. It looked like sloppiness. A requisition for batteries dated months after disposal. A missing form that should have lived between decommission and strike. A typed memo about final inventory, stamped received, on a day the boat was supposedly already gone. A supply clerk circled the dates in red pencil, the way you circle a spelling error you can't unsee. He kicked it upstairs. The request came back with a note. Reassigned. New desk, new building. No more red pencil. Meanwhile, a shipyard foreman kept a memory that wouldn't sit down. He remembered a tow that wasn't on the weekend roster. Dark pier. Minimal lights. Men who didn't speak. The tug cast off, but the submarine's bow wave told a different story. For a moment, the boat moved as if the ocean recognized an old gate. Under its own power, he said later. Not a dead hull. A living one. The official path had no room for the living. You started with a name. You ended with a number struck from a list. The process was a ledger breathing in and out. Assets in, assets out. Inspector marks on grease-stained clipboards. Photographs tacked to file covers. A bow. A stern. A chalked signature of the hull number before paint covered it for the last time. What nobody knew at the time was that names could be buried without bodies. If a submarine needed to disappear but still be used, you didn't repaint its story in public. You bent the paper until it folded into a shape that hid the truth. Hull plates could be swapped. A sail could inherit a number that belonged to a sister. A cable could be rerouted through a training unit with a line of accounting that meant nothing to anyone without the right clearance. On paper, the boat was asleep forever. In water, it could still breathe. The stakes weren't abstract. Reactivated boats meant crew lists that never reached next of kin, pay stubs routed through cutouts, logbooks closed with the wrong dates. If a submarine sailed after its funeral, somebody's husband never had a grave, only a phrase, lost at sea, circumstances undisclosed. That's not closure. That's a door that never stops rattling in the wind. Patterns revealed themselves in the places you'd expect them least. A yard worker remembered a stenciled crate marked for disposal that arrived empty. A watchstander recalled a late-night phone call moving a crane out of sightlines. Small things. Human-scale details that felt like grit under the tongue. None of it proved anything, but altogether, it made a sound. A low hum that said the rhythm had changed. By the end of the drawdowns, almost everyone could recite the drill. The last crew signs the last form. The chaplain says nothing because this isn't a funeral. The tug makes a bowline fast, and the ocean takes another body. Except in one folder. The body got up and walked. A later battery purchase shouldn't exist. Batteries are a heartbeat for a diesel-electric boat. You don't buy a heartbeat for a corpse. A later requisition for cold weather gear, tagged to a training unit that never trained anyone, shouldn't exist either. Nor should a message routing slip with a familiar call sign, stamped received in a coastal station long after the radio should have been ash. Each detail could be a clerical bruise. Together, they looked like fingerprints. While that was happening in the ledgers, a diver's rumor drifted through bars near the base. A hull on a restricted shelf with the wrong pennant number. Laughable if you need clean answers. Uncomfortable if you've ever painted a number you were told not to ask about. The paper trail said it died. Eyewitnesses said it moved. And somewhere between those two truths, a submarine learned how to live in the margins. Rumors spread first in places where light is low and stories travel easier. Divers talked about a hull they weren't supposed to see, parked on a restricted shelf like a misplaced shadow. The number stenciled on the sail didn't match the shape beneath. Too many limber holes, the wrong pattern of welds. Anyone who's traced a fingertip along a submarine's skin knows. The body remembers what the paint tries to hide. A memorandum surfaced the way all inconvenient things surface. Half intact, edges smoked by redaction. Temporary reactivation for evaluation. No destination listed. No return receipt logged. The signature block was a blur of black ink, but the routing line carried a familiar office code. It shouldn't have touched that office. Not if the boat was dead. This was the first solid breath after the hum. Reactivation meant budgets that didn't exist on paper, crews sworn to silence, parts drawn through shell commands with meaningless names. It meant a boat leaving a pier with a wake nobody could acknowledge. And if a wake exists, there are footprints to follow. Fuel orders drifted through intermediaries, teletype headers. A whisper of radio checks bounced off the ionosphere. A tender's manifest with a line item that looked wrong until you knew what to look for. Requests went out under the Freedom of Information Act. Careful, narrow, designed to leave as little room for denial as possible. The envelopes came back heavy with black ink. Names gone, locations gone. Dates left standing like fence posts in a field of burned grass. But in the margin of one page, a pencil note someone forgot to scrub. A code name, short and sharp, and a date 1 month after the official scuttling. A breadcrumb that didn't mean much alone. Put next to the battery requisition, it started to talk. Then a human voice cut through the static. A radio man's widow kept a postcard for years, tucked behind a family photograph. The postmark was from a port her husband never visited, stamped months after the submarine's supposed end. Weather's rough, but morale steady, he wrote in careful, impersonal lines. He wasn't a poetic man. He was precise. He wrote, we. He didn't write, I. If this was a deployment, it was one he couldn't name. If it wasn't, why did the date pinch? What nobody knew at the time was how simple it could be to hide a hull in plain sight. Plates could be swapped where the eye looked first. Registry tricks moved a number like a shell game, slipping it under a sister boat long enough to confuse anyone counting noses at the pier. Training units absorbed sailors whose pay stubs bore harmless titles. If the boat needed to be reborn, it could inherit an alias and sail as something else entirely. Officially, it was a yard asset. Practically, it was a blade slipped back into the dark. A micro-story turns rumor into breath. In a storage locker at a small maritime museum, a chipped coffee mug carried a name scratched with a mess knife. Initials matching a machinist who allegedly mustered out before the drawdown. But beneath the initials, a date. 2 months late. People don't usually etch lies into ceramic, not when they think nobody will ever read them. Meanwhile, an internal supply bulletin drifted across a desk. Cold water gear, bulk issue, destination, training unit. The quantities didn't match a classroom. They matched a crew. You could outfit 24 men with that shipment, maybe more if everyone doubled up. The note in the corner said, expedite. Expedite for who? If nobody was sailing, the stakes climbed quietly. Reactivated boats leave behind families with no funeral to attend, only a pause where a letter should be. They leave behind sailors who learn to speak in erasures. We were nowhere, doing nothing, for nobody. And if something happens out there, there's no code word a casualty officer can say that makes sense to a wife sitting at a kitchen table. The last page of the redacted packet carried one line that survived the blade. End X when retrieval complete. Not evaluation. Retrieval. Boats don't evaluate the sea. They go out to take something back, or to put something down where no one can find it. If this submarine sailed again, it left a wake, thin, scattered, but real. Fuel, messages, a target the ocean remembers. We followed the stains, and they led straight into the dark. The first clean thread came from a basement lined with reel-to-reel tape. A retired oceanographer had saved everything. Hydrophone logs from coastal arrays, annotated in pencil with tide notes and ship classes he guessed by ear. He'd labeled one folder simply, unassigned screw. He played us a clip. 4 blades, a faint wobble after the 3rd beat. The sound was unmistakable if you'd ever leaned over a sub's stern and listened. It matched the class our ghost belongs to. He'd marked the recording with a weather note. Gale warning offshore, barometer falling. Good cover, bad visibility. If you wanted to move unseen, you'd pick that night. He slid another tape across the desk. Same signature. 40 miles north, 17 hours later. The ocean forgets faces. It remembers footsteps. To test the pattern, we laid the sounds against things that don't lie. Weather logs, Coast Guard advisories, fishing closures, tanker schedules. Tankers keep time like metronomes. They don't swerve unless there's a reason. The maps showed slight deviations along a line that kissed the coastline, then stepped out just far enough to breathe. Something had shadowed them, then peeled away where charts grow sparse. Meanwhile, a human voice colored the map. A destroyer's lookout wrote in his personal notebook, just a few lines from a night he couldn't file. Shape of beam. No answer on challenge. Gone before the 2nd call. He sketched what he saw. Not a trawler, not a whale. A low, rounded back that slips into black water like a practiced breath. He didn't report it. You don't fill forms for shadows that outrank you. We reconstructed a route from 3 nights of intercepted bearings, triangulating from shore stations that used to catalogue Soviet boats. The plot wasn't beautiful. It kinked and doubled back, as if the crew changed their mind midstream. But the node points lined up with places that mattered. A shallow patch near a cable landing charted in fine print. A shelf outside a weapons test range, where navies practice what they don't admit. Boats don't linger there unless they've been told to. Then it got stranger. The signatures reappeared weeks later near a different range, across a swing of water too far for a casual transit during that period. A submarine can cross it, sure, but the timing suggested logistics. Tenders, prepositioned fuel, a rhythm that smelled like orders. You don't improvise those hops. You rehearse them. What nobody knew at the time was that the only maintenance record left in the paper chain was for batteries, new cells, off books. We found an invoice routed through a vendor that mostly supplied research labs. The quantities would fit the class if you shaved safety margins. No yard period was listed. That means a pier job at night. Tarps up, guards posted. You can't refresh a heartbeat quietly. But they tried. Why the ranges? Why the cable site? An oceanographer would tell you the seabed is a filing cabinet. Cables lay like veins, carrying secrets you can hear if you learn to listen sideways. A clandestine salvage test or a cable tap trial would explain the route, the loitering, the need for fresh batteries. You don't want to run a diesel when you're parked under someone's future embarrassment. A micro-story anchors the abstract. A fisherman out of a small harbour complained that his lines were cut clean one foggy dawn. No fray, no bite, just a surgical parting. He was compensated in cash by a safety officer who never gave a last name. He didn't press it. He bought new line. But he remembered the smell on the man's jacket, diesel and cold steel. That detail doesn't fade. We kept pulling thread. One hydrophone hit carried a faint overlay, an echo that shouldn't have been there, like a steady ticking not matched to the prop. The oceanographer leaned closer. "Winch," he said. "Light load, not anchor chain. Something paying out or in. If you're above a cable head or a test article, a winch sings in metal-throated whispers." The tape caught one. Meanwhile, a coastal radio log recorded 3 bursts of encrypted traffic inside a window when no exercise had been published. The headers were odd, formatting you'd expect from a unit that hadn't updated its habits. Short, tight, no repeats. Someone was checking in to say, "On stationer, commencing, complete." The stakes rose in the margins. A widow remembered a phone call that was only breathing and a click. Another wife found a pay stub that reached their mailbox 2 months late, stamped training in a blank where a unit name should live. They knew not to ask. Questions make doors close. But their calendars carried quiet grief you can read between the penciled notes for groceries and dentist appointments. In the aftermath of those nights, a tender logged a stop that never made the public schedule. We saw it in a galley inventory. Sudden depletion of fresh produce, replenished 2 days later. You don't feed ghosts. You feed men who aren't supposed to be hungry. The wake ended in a place raconteurs call the Mennonite graveyard. Quiet, uncharted, avoided by charts and avoided by look. We went with them in their telling. A submarine lay there too intact, as if placed, not wrecked. Paint layers betrayed 2 identities. The lower one faint, the upper one neat. They ran raking light along the sail. Underneath the topcoat, a stencil bled through like an old bruise. It matched the number on the dead file, and in that water, with the weight of history closing around them, they found silence that felt alive somehow. They said the wreck lay as if it had chosen the angle. Bow slightly downslope. Sail canted just enough to catch a glancing beam. Not torn apart. Not broken open. Intact in a way that suggested intent, not accident. Wreck hunters hovered outside the collapse range, bubbles rising like thoughts you don't speak. They took paint samples with a careful hand. Under the fresh grey, a duller coat flaked up in curls. Two identities layered like a lie, told twice. They worked the sail with raking light. The beam slid, found a ridge the eye missed, a sequence of edges too straight to be random. Sanded gently, the topcoat surrendered. The faint stencil below wasn't complete at first, just a ghost line of a curve, the hint of a numeral. Then the floodlights shifted, and the number resolved, unmistakable. The same sequence that had been struck from the naval vessel register years earlier. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The sea made a soft, constant sound, as if reminding them who held the story. A micro-story surfaced with the silt. On a valve manifold near the forward trim tank, a handle was chipped at the edge, worn smooth by a thumb that liked to worry metal during long watches. Along the flat, someone had etched initials with a sharpened scribe and marked a date. The date should have been impossible. Weeks after the boat's supposed end. It wasn't neat. It was rushed. Men don't decorate steel that's about to die. They leave marks so someone knows they were here. Stakes sharpened. Finding personal marks turned rumor into names, and names have families. A carved initial is a doorbell at a kitchen table decades later. It asks for an answer nobody knows how to give. If this boat lived after death, then somebody's knock never came. Somebody waited for a folded flag that never left the armory shelf. Complications arrived like registered mail. Federal warning letters found the wreck team's mailboxes, polite at first, then firm. Protected site, sensitive material, cease interference. A small maritime museum that had quietly agreed to loan a recovered non-critical artifact, a corroded depth gauge face, reversed course with a short note. We cannot participate. A curator whispered later on a switched phone. We were asked to reconsider for national security. Asked is a generous word when the person doing the asking wears authority like a uniform. Meanwhile, in a fluorescent office far from water, a clerk slid a copy of a requisition under the door of someone who still cared. Cold water gear, bulk issue, destination, training unit. The quantities matched a full complement. The date matched the window the hydrophone hits suggested. Training doesn't take place on a hull that never left a pier. Training doesn't erase names from stone. Unknown to them, across town, a diver carried a small brass tag into a meeting with a lawyer. It was a locker plate, 2 screws still holding rust in their threads. The back bore grease the color of old coffee. Inside the locker, when they opened it underwater, they'd found something no one expected to survive. A paper packet wrapped in oilskin, rubber-banded twice. The sea had tried to read it and failed. Inside, a partial log. Not the decorative kind, the work kind. Terse entries, spare language, the captain's hand. He wrote dates that should not exist. He wrote positions in code he didn't bother to decode, because code was habit. He wrote ordered verbal, received verbal, the way a man protects a chain that doesn't want to be seen. The entries didn't tell a whole story. They told fragments. On station, cable head located, winch noise intermittent, battery temps climbing. Then, casualty drill suspended. Not drill. Then a line he underlined twice. No Mayday. Orders stand. The captain's name matched the signature scratched into steel back in the archive photographs. The hand was the same. A long tail on the final letter, a habit of pressing too hard on dates. Handwriting analysis is a human art, not a courtroom science. But men who write logs carry their hands with them to the grave. This one felt like a man writing while the boat hummed beneath him, tight on air and time. Parallel action deepened the shadow. The same week the letters hit mailboxes, a retired tender cook mentioned an unscheduled feed to a training debt that stayed aboard a pier minder's berth after midnight. 25 hot plates, extra coffee, extra bread. They were hungry, he said. Training doesn't eat like that at 2 in the morning. The divers returned with a better plan, better lights, and a decision to document, not disturb. They filmed the sail from keel to cap. Barnacles made constellations over weld seams. In one seam, near the aft edge, a small patch line didn't match the yard pattern of the supposed class. It matched yard work from a different coast. That meant transit. That meant the boat didn't die where the file said it did. What nobody knew at the time was that the partial log held a last coordinate scribble. Not in code, almost as an afterthought. The way a man writes a grocery item in the margin. It pointed toward a break in the seabed, where cables bend before they climb. The notation beside it was a single word. Return. The meaning landed slow. The hull didn't want to be found because the story that held it together depended on distance. Distance from families, from ledgers, from the warm places where memory keeps score. Yet it left marks for anyone persistent enough to follow. Paint over a number long enough, the metal remembers. Etch your initials into a valve, the ocean carries them like a prayer. The letters kept coming. The warnings grew quieter, which is worse. Silence from authority feels like a hand on your shoulder that never squeezes, never leaves. The museum, for now, stayed away. The divers, for now, stayed careful. And the partial log, in a climate-controlled box that smelled faintly of vinegar and old rubber, pointed to one more night in the life of a boat that wasn't supposed to have any nights left. The crisis that explains the silence waited at the edge of the shelf, in water that keeps secrets well. Context came later, like a tide chart found after the storm. A sabotage scare along undersea infrastructure, whispers of a cut line, a missing device that didn't belong on the seabed, orders issued verbally, no tape, no signatures, only voices that carried rank. The partial log turned blunt. Task: trace sever, recover artifact. A word you use when you don't want to name what you're lifting. The crew swore to silence, because silence was the mission's first tool. A human voice waited beside the log. Folded into the oilskin, a single letter in pencil, cramped and careful. A young machinist, writing to someone he called L. He thanked her for the sweater. He wrote about air that tasted like batteries and salt. He wrote one sentence that didn't belong to any exercise. If we bring this up, don't wait up. The letter was never mailed. The sea kept it until the locker gave it back. Complication arrived fast in the captain's hand. Contact made. Recovery engaged. Then a shift. Cell temps rising. Diesel electrics live and die by chemistry. Push a battery under load too long and it cooks itself. The next line was spare. Smoke forward. Then, flood port side to check. Controlled flooding is not panic. It's a calculation you make when heat meets oxygen in a steel lung with nowhere to go. There was no mayday in the log. There was a phrase instead. Orders stand. A set of words that can feel like steel when water climbs the deck. To admit the mission would expose the program. To call for help would explain why you were there. So you learn a different kind of courage. The kind that keeps the radio dark. Decision reads like a whisper you overhear. Scuttle deep. Not at the first shelf, where rescue might find a shadow. Beyond it, where the boat would lie intact, quiet, and convincing enough to be mistaken for a planned end. The captain underlined one last line. Registry remains. On paper, keeping the vessel not decommissioned preserved funding lines and authorized parts, In practice, it kept men unspoken. Impact was paperwork that couldn't say the word death. Status codes extended. Training units billed coffee at 2 in the morning. Families circled dates without the relief of a knock. The program lived because the boat, officially, still lived. The truth suffocated in margins. We returned to the first clue. The signature scratched into steel, dated after death. It wasn't hubris. It was a mark for anyone who would listen later. We were here. We did what we were told. Tell it right. The submarine was never decommissioned, because secrecy needed a living cover. And the price was borne by men whose names were filed under silence. Some machines are kept alive so the truth can't breathe. And in the dark between orders and oxygen, a crew chose duty over daylight.